So welcome to the first water, wetlands and watersheds seminar of fall 2020. I believe this is our 48th year of presenting these seminars. So that's over, let's see, that's 96 semesters. So something on the order of 1,000 seminars being delivered since 1973. 3-1, whenever it was. So we're very lucky to have as our sort of kicking off this semester is Dr. Cherie Westbrook. Before I introduce her, I'm just going to go over a couple of logistics. So if you are in the room right now, of course, your mic is off and your camera can be on or off, your choice. We'll have questions at the end, but you can always add questions in the chat. For those of you on YouTube, Sherilyn Sweeney, Dr. Sweeney will also be monitoring the chat there and bringing those questions into the main Zoom room. For those of you watching later via recording, of course, enjoy and make sure to get your assignments in if you are enrolled for the credit. Dr. Clark, any other announcements before we go on?
No, that's it. Just make sure, again, if you're registered, you do need to submit a brief summary of the presentation so that you get full credit for quote unquote attendance. So,
all right, with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cherie Westbrook. Dr. Westbrook leads the Wetland Ecohydrology Research Group at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. She also serves as the Associate Editor for the Annals of the American Association of Geographers. And she's the director of, I had to look up the acronym, but the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, so NSERC in Canada, their collaborative research and training experience program in water security. Dr. Westbrook is particularly interested in mountains and mountain environments. Her group looks at the role of beavers. We'll hear about beavers as natural damming agents today, and also the response of wetlands and other ecosystems to climate change. And she's really interested in getting her science into practice and policy to sort of change how wetland and other ecosystems are conserved. And she also has a passion for knowledge dissemination and student mentoring, bringing the best ideas and purpose and potential out of her students and colleagues. So with that, Cherie, the floor is yours. You can go ahead and share.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, David and Sherilyn. It's quite an honor to be here and to be your guinea pig for the YouTube streaming. I'll do my best to not say too much, but so before, can you see my screen? Can everybody see my screen?
No, we cannot see your screen yet. I had stopped your share previously. So.
Oh, okay, that's why. Okay, there. So now we can see it?
Yeah.
So just before I begin and dig into beaver dammed wetlands, I wanted to have a moment of pause. In Canada, I can turn my slide. If in Canada, and I think in the US as well, scholars are on strike to respectively acknowledge today that the lives of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color matter. And I wanted to acknowledge that. Okay, so today in our talk, we're going to start by sharing a little bit about beavers. As far as I know, there aren't any beavers in Florida, so I thought it might be good to share some of their natural history. And then we'll flow into the general research question that a portion of my team is working on and discuss some specifics about beaver dams, beaver ponds, and the eco-hydrological processes they alter. And we'll wrap up by putting these pieces together into a conceptualization and discuss what I think ought to be some next steps and future research directions. And of course, there's no I in research. It's my name on the front of the talk, but these are the many students and postdoctoral fellows who contributed to the data that I'm going to be sharing today in very meaningful ways, of course. And so I wanted to show all their smiley faces. So Amanda, Daniel, Alistair, Carly, and Colin. Okay, thank you to them. All right, beavers. This is a beaver from Saskatchewan with its little baby. If I've learned anything about studying beavers over the past few decades, is that people hold extremely strong opinions of them. They either love beaver or they hate beaver, and there aren't too many people in between. Regardless of kind of what camp they sit in, the love or hate. People I meet tend to have a beaver story to share with me, and I absolutely love that. So that's pretty wonderful. Beavers are the second largest rodent in the world after capybara. They can weigh up to about 45 kilograms and live somewhere in the range of 23 years under good conditions. They are semi-aquatic mammals and are well adapted to water living. They have thick fur that they waterproof by spreading the castor oil that they secrete from their anal gland across their body. And they have this big, broad, flat tail that serves as a perfect rudder. Beaver tend to mate for life in most cases. Sometimes they get a divorce though. They breed in winter and they have their babies called kits in the spring. And they live as a family unit, what we refer to as a colony. And that includes the parents, the kits, like you see pictured here, and the young of the year before. So you can have, 6 to 10 beaver living in a colony unit. Here's a map from Canadian Geographic that I really like because they make pretty maps. But what you can see historically is that beaver occupied much of North America in the past, except for a few key places. And those places are like the North Slope of Alaska, northern Nunavut, which is the northern part of Canada you see in white up there. And of course, most of the Florida Peninsula. And beaver live in a very wide range of habitats. They live in small rivers, they live in really big rivers, they live in brackish wetlands, peatlands, lakes, mineral wetlands, and even storm sewer drains. So they pretty much capitalized on any available habitat that has water moving through it or water that's near the surface that could be easily accessed by their excellent digging skills. Okay, so before the fur trade, which started around 1600 in North America on the East Coast and moved kind of northward and westward, the beaver population was estimated to be somewhere between 60 and 400 million. So what that means is we really have no idea how many beaver there were in the past, except for that there were a lot, enough to generate a lot of revenue and almost extirpate a species. So that extirpation started in about the 1600s and ended the widespread extirpation of the species ended by about the early 1900s because there were changes in fashion in Europe. The idea of having beaver hats went out of fashion, but also because there were growing public concerns about the beaver population and the smallness of it. So this led to a whole series of trapping regulations and reintroduction programs. There are still reintroduction programs going on in many places in the United States, not too many in Canada that I know of. As you can see in this little table that we published a few years ago, the beaver population in the year 2000, which is when these numbers is from, in North America, was somewhere between 9 and 50 million beaver. So what we think is beaver have recovered to about 10% of their original population size. They have recovered across almost all of the habitats that they used to live in, though just at a much lower density than in the past. And the North American beaver population is continuing to recover. We don't have a good handle on the number of beaver, save for a few specific places where detailed population studies are happening. Europe is doing a much better job at keeping track of their beaver. Okay, so beaver have two roles in ecosystems as agents of disturbance. They have these long, continuously growing incisors that are very characteristically orange in color. They use to cut down woody plants and they eat the bark. And this type of forage and the quantity of it, the type of forage and the quantity of it, things like aspen or other deciduous species, determines how long a beaver colony can actually occupy a site before they have to move on to a new site. And they need about 100 hectares of material, forest material, in order to kind of successfully establish a colony for a few years. And they can stay in these sites from anywhere from kind of 1 year to maybe 20 to 50 years, depending on the site quality. Some of the cut material isn't readily ingested and is instead used for construction. For example, beaver around here cut a lot of alder species, and they tend to not really eat the bark, but they put them into their construction materials. So they build dams like you see pictured here on the right, but they also build lodges, and they can live in the banks where they dig out little spaces to live, and then they'll throw some sticks on the top of the bank where they have air holes for themselves. Okay, and so through this creation of beaver dams and then the canals that they dig to access other forage material, beaver can greatly influence the ecosystem forming processes that we're going to talk about today. And in this way, they act as a really important ecosystem engineer. So the combination of hydrological, ecological, and geomorphic changes that beaver make to stream systems is conceptualized here in this figure. And it's a cycle, and there could be an arrow there between 4 and 1 again, so that go round and around the circle. Okay, so beaver will build a dam or a series of dams, a network of dams, on a stream channel as pictured here. And that dam or dams will flood the riparian areas, drown trees, drown other woody vegetation, and raise the water table kind of outside of that zone of inundation. That in the area that is inundated, sediment tends to be deposited on the riparian surface, and the sediment tends to be reasonably nutrient rich. So when the ponds are abandoned, like you see in number 3, they start draining because no one's maintaining the beaver dam itself anymore, so they start leaking more. And new vegetation can start taking hold and rejuvenate that riparian surface. So time and time again, through the cycle of beaver colonization and abandonment of a site, riparian wetlands are formed and maintained. Okay, so that's great. That was all about streams, and we're here to discuss wetlands and beaver damming of wetlands. Okay, so as I mentioned before, streams are the things that are popular. When we think of a beaver dam, we think of a beaver dam on a stream. But beaver are damming way more kinds of ecosystems than just streams. And I have some examples here that I've encountered through my research. They can certainly dam glacial outflows like this one in Tierra del Fuego, Argentina. They're growingly common in tidal marshes where there's some really neat research going on in the Pacific Northwest of the US. And of course, when we think about Canada, we think about them damming peatlands because we have a lot of those. What I plan to focus on today is kind of this last one here at the bottom right, is peatlands. And now why would I want to do that? Okay, so I think there's this really nice piece of research that was published in 2000 by Gorham's group. And what they showed in this paper was the distribution of peatlands across North America and their origins, or when they were first initiated. And what I particularly love about that paper is they have this figure in here, which I'm sorry I extracted a poor quality version, but it is places where there are peatlands with beaver fossils in them. And what's really neat about this is that this provides evidence that beaver are actually quite common in wetlands, in peatlands. Originally, there was thought that peatlands were marginal beaver habitat, but here we're finding fossils that are thousands of years old, showing that there has been coevolution of beaver and peatlands together. Okay, so that leads me to kind of the overarching question, or one of the overarching questions my team tries to tackle, is how do beaver dams affect ecohydrological processes of peatlands? So the research advances I'm showing today have been made mostly through studying beaver inhabited wetlands and peatlands in the southern Canadian Rockies. I have an arrow here to show you kind of where our sites are. We are studying an area called Kananaskis Country, which is a series of provincial parks in Alberta. That it's kind of sandwiched between Calgary to the east and Banff National Park to the west, although we do a little bit of work in Banff as well. Okay, so that's where we're at, and that's where these results are. So the map on the left is Kananaskis Country and the series of parks that make it up. And all of the dots that you see, regardless of their color, is the results of some census work that we did to find wetlands in the region and determine if they were peatlands and determine beaver habitation or occupation of those sites. And so what we found was that a lot of wetlands are actually peatlands in this region. So 70% of the wetlands we found are peatlands, and we found just over 500 wetlands in total. So it's a large number of wetlands and a large number of peatlands for, you know, a place that's not the boreal forest. And of those peatlands that we found, 70% actually had beaver dams in them. And what beaver do in these peatlands is create greater open water extent. So 4 to 7 times the open water extent in peatlands that have beaver dams than places that do not. So how exactly do beaver dam peatlands? Okay, so they can do that in a couple different ways. In my observations, we rarely see in the Rockies places where beaver have built just one dam in a peatland. They tend to build collections of dams or dam complexes, such as you see pictured here on the right. This is one of our sites that we've been studying for quite some time. In some peatlands, they dam the streams that are flowing through them. Remember that we're working in the Rockies, so we're not working in areas without some topography. Our peatlands are actually quite sloping as compared to something, say, in the boreal forest that's quite flat. So lots of the peatlands in the Rockies have streams flowing through them, and beaver will build a whole series of dams in that area to spread out water flow and create these deeper water pools in which they are safer from predators than if they were to just have, you know, one little pool and travel over land. Okay. So in places where you have streams flowing through peatlands and beaver damming them, you end up with bathymetric maps looking something like what you see on the left-hand side, where you can clearly see where the original stream channels were and the area that was then flooded by the beaver ponds. And that'll be important coming up a little bit later. But in other places, there is no surface water in the peatlands to dam, yet beaver still build plenty of beaver dams like you see in this particular picture that's kind of sandwiched between a highway and the Kananaskis River flowing through Kananaskis Country. And what happens is that beaver are actually damming groundwater seepage. And they do that by using their excellent digging skills. They will start in a very small little area and actually dig out all of the sediment and start piling it in these long dam structures. And they end up looking something like berms. So this is an example of a peatland right near a mineral area, because you can see some gravel there at the forefront of the picture. And so these kinds of beaver dams end up with kind of very even bathymetric maps, as you can see here in the little inset. Okay. So dam length, how does it compare among sites? I have to move my picture of myself, sorry. Okay, go back. All right, so there are some factors influencing dam length. On the left, I have the water source influencing it, and on the right, site characteristics. So first of all, it matters whether these beaver dams are located in stream environments versus spring environments in terms of their length. Statistically, beaver dams built in groundwater seepage areas tend to be longer, probably because they're trying to collect a slower moving amount of water over a larger area. And in fact, the longest dam in the world that you might have heard in the news up in northern Alberta is a spring-fed dam. And that's probably why it's so long. In terms of site characteristics, on average, beaver dams built in peatlands are longer than mineral wetlands. But interestingly, if you break it down a little bit farther, there's more of a story there. You really actually need some kind of sizable woody material near the peatlands in order for beaver to build longer dams. So we looked at whether a site had aspen within 100 meters of the beaver pond. And when we have aspen present, dams in peatlands are longer than they would be without aspen. And in mineral wetlands, it doesn't really matter at all. They can use a wider variety of woody material to build dams. Okay. So this idea that there's beaver dams from different water sources, they're different in shapes, and we showed some examples already of bathymetric maps and how they look quite different. And I added a third here to the right, to the left-hand side, so you can see they become even more diverse. And so even though we have this great diversity in what beaver ponds actually look like in the environments in which they're created, we can actually accurately approximate their water storage volume by just thinking of them as bowls. And so some neat work that one of my past PhD students, Dan Karen, did is looking at the bathymetric shape of the beaver ponds. And he had a shape factor in there, the P factor. And what he found is a strong statistical relationship with bathymetric water capacity that he could then relate to the area of beaver ponds statistically, and also their water depth. And so he was able to get estimates of water storage capacity in beaver ponds accurate to about 5% of what the actual volume was, regardless of what shape of beaver ponds we end up having out there. So that's a really neat advancement, I think. So it isn't just the amount of water that's stored in the beaver ponds that's of interest. Also of interest, and something driving a lot of eco-hydrological processes, is the hydraulic head that is created by beaver ponds. So how much water there is in the beaver pond compared to what's in the more downstream environment. So we have come up with this metric here, the delta H value, to kind of show that hydraulic head difference above and below a beaver dam. And so larger values of delta H mean you have a greater volume of water stored in the beaver pond. There's a greater regulation of the beaver dam on stream flow. And there's actually much more enhanced hydrologic connectivity between streams and riparian areas, or peatlands, peatland streams and their riparian areas when you have higher delta H. So what drives delta H, or really the height of a beaver dam? Okay, so there's a few things. The first one I wanted to share is what the dam is comprised of. So not all dams are made of the same materials. We talked about beaver dams being made of that peat, right? So sediment materials, where they don't tend to have a lot of sticks, and it really is just a lot of soil that's been piled up. And then we have dams on the other end of the spectrum that are comprised almost entirely of woody material. Those are extremely common and are probably the pictures you've seen most often in the popular culture. And then you have these dams in the middle. They're a little bit of sediment mixed with a little bit of wood and sometimes a few other things. Once I found a surfboard in a beaver dam too. But what we see is that the delta H, the height of beaver dams, the hydraulic head of beaver dams, is greater with more wood in them than having just sediment in them, statistically greater. So once you it's kind of like cement and how we pour cement, I think. So if you have cement by itself, you can't pour it very thickly because it's not very structurally intact. What you need to do to make kind of taller amounts of of a cement pad, for example, would be to insert rebar into it. So it'll add the structural integrity. So I liken kind of these mixed dams to that situation. Whereas if you have the wood, it's kind of like serves as the rebar, and the sediment serves as the glue. The other really interesting thing is we found a lot of rocks in beaver dams. So in comparing beaver dams with rocks and without, we found that the delta H value is significantly higher when there are rocks. We don't really understand too much of whether beaver are purposely putting rocks in to build the dams higher and increase their structural integrity, or if they're just kind of using whatever materials they can because perhaps their sediment is washing away in higher flows. So we don't really understand it yet, but there is clearly a difference in how much difference in water level there is between the upstream and downstream side of the beaver dam if rocks are there. And the third thing that seems to be statistically influencing the delta H is the structural integrity of a dam. So this is what we've called dam flow state. It's an update from the Wu and Waddington classification from 1990, where they had these kind of 4 categories. Overflow dams, where water is primarily moving across the top of the dam. Gap flow, where there's some holes in the dam and water is moving through it. Through flow, where water is really just moving in between all the sticks that are making up the dam structure. Or underflow, where there's a hole in the bottom of the dam structure and water's draining out that way. We've added a few classifications to that. So we have seep dams, where it's not clear exactly where the water is coming from. So it's probably looping through hyporheic flow processes and emerging on the downstream side. And these mixed states, where you have more than one kind of class of flow state happening at the same time. So how does that play out in terms of delta H? Well, interestingly, it kind of depends on which flow state you're in as to what the delta H is going to be. There are some similarities, of course, between some of the flow states, like mixed and overflow dams tend to have little slightly higher delta H than something like a through flow dam or a seep dam, but not. Yeah. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was what's happening in the near stream zone, or in the peatland kind of near the pond itself, whether or not there's a stream there. And so we've been exploring one particular long-term site in the Kananaskis region called Sibbald Fen, which I'll show you some pictures of a little bit later. And one of the other pieces of research Dan and Karen did was to look at this semi-variogram of water tables in relation to how far away they are from beaver ponds in this site. And we had this site being studied for several years. So we had the situation where there were many beaver dams in the site, and then we had a large flood happen, and most of the beaver dams were breached. So we had a period of time with almost no beaver ponds in the system that were intact. And what he found, interestingly, was that when beaver ponds are in the system, they elevate the water table of the peatland. And it's kind of a little bit of a mind twist, because when we think of peatlands, we think of these ecosystems that are already wet. They're a type of wetland after all. But even in a peatland, beaver are seemingly able to elevate the water table. And they elevate it by about 13 centimeters, according to our research, over a zone of influence of about 150 meters from the beaver pond itself. When you don't have any beaver dams in the system, the water table is still elevated near the stream. So the stream does have some of an influence on the local water table, but that water table elevation is kind of about 115 meters. So this kind of breach scenario here, where you can see the asymptote is occurring at about 115 meters. So beaver can extend that kind of zone of influence of water table elevation over what the stream can do on its own. The other thing that happens when beaver dam peatlands is that they stabilize water tables, and this is quite similar to what happens in riparian areas or other kinds of mineral wetlands. And so here on the right, we have little maps of this Sibbald fen and 4 different scenarios. So the 2 scenarios at the top are both scenarios with beaver in them. On the left, we have a wet scenario, and on the right, we have quite a dry scenario. And at the bottom, we have 2 scenarios, wet and dry, of what the fen looked like with no beaver in it. And the thing that you can see are the color differences among the sites. So the the areas that are in black are areas of high stability in the water table. So not a lot of variation over time, over the summer period, I should mention. So from kind of May 1st through the end of August would be the period we were studying. And then the really lighter gray colors is low stability. So a lot of water table variation over that summer period. So what we can clearly see in these maps is that when beaver are in the system, regardless of whether it's wet or dry, there's much higher percentage of the fen that has high water tables and high water table stability. And even in wet conditions, we see without beaver, we don't see high water stability, water table stability across the peatland as much as we see it in the conditions where we have dry. So on the left, what I have here is kind of the typical groundwater level hydrograph for this particular peatland in the absence of beavers. So we have this period, this is 2019 data. So last summer's data, and we see that the water table kind of in spring is near the ground surface, and then as soon as the plants start growing quite a bit into July, we see massive water table declines, which are pretty typical in mountain peatlands of up to about 70 centimeters. Okay, so about 2 feet of water table decline. Okay. So that was the water table. Now I want to kind of go back to those beaver ponds themselves. So what we have here is a whole collection of beaver ponds that we've been monitoring over 2019 and 2018, and looking at what their pond water storage looks like over that time. And we can see that several of the ponds have quite stable water levels. So the top left-hand corner, we have Barrier Sap, Barrier Grande, Chive Moose, and Chive Vista. All have very flat hydrographs where the percent full of the ponds is close to 100 for the entire monitoring period. But then we have these ponds that are kind of on the right-hand side, lower down, where the water levels are extremely dynamic. So this suggests to us that beaver ponds are probably much more dynamic in terms of their water level variations than we've previously thought. I think when I talk to people, people think of ponds as being already full. And so how could you possibly regulate flow if you have a pond that's already full? But this research is suggesting that some ponds are full and probably have a lower ability to regulate water flows downstream. And some ponds have much more dynamic levels and so have greater storage capacity at certain times of the year. And I think some of this storage capacity comes from the fact that we're finding that beaver ponds in peatlands have leaky bottoms. So here shown on the right is the hydraulic conductivity, a measure of the permeability of the material underlying beaver ponds. In this case, everything was in peat. So we have measurements at 25 centimeters depth and 50 centimeters depth of hydraulic conductivity measured in situ and interpreted using the Horsley equations. And the blue bars are for beaver pond bottoms, and the green bars are intact or undisturbed peat that's kind of close to the beaver ponds, but not certainly not in them, so not beaver disturbed. And what we see is significantly higher hydraulic conductivity in the beaver pond sediments than an intact peat. So there's something going on where we're having beaver, the actual act of beaver flooding a site increases the hydraulic conductivity of the underlying peat. And we're still trying to figure out the reasons why, but we think it might have a biogeochemical origin in terms of carbon mobilization. Okay. So what we did this past year, 2019, 2018, 19, and 20, was to leave some water level loggers in ponds over winter, far away from the ice. It gets pretty cold in this part of the world. -40 is not an unusual temperature. And so you have to make sure that your loggers are stowed away from the ice. So beaver ponds will freeze in winter at the surface to maybe 2 to 3 feet thick. And the surrounding peatland will also freeze somewhere in the range of kind of 30 to 70 centimeters of ground ice is what we can expect to see, seasonal frost. Okay, but interestingly, of course, the bottom of the beaver ponds remains unfrozen. So it's the only real part of the peatland that can interact with the groundwater system that's underlying it, so the underlying alluvial aquifers in the wintertime. And so what we're seeing is that water levels decline in the beaver ponds over the winter period. So we get quite a large dewatering of our beaver ponds under those winter conditions under ice. And this is important because if the ponds are empty by the end of winter, you should have storage capacity for water during the snowmelt runoff period, which should help attenuate downstream flows during kind of the peak of the season, the flow season. And so we were able to test out these ideas in an extreme flood. So I'm not sure if you've heard, but in Alberta in 2013, June 2013, there was a natural disaster. At the time, it was the worst natural disaster in Canadian history. It's now been downgraded to the 3rd worst national disaster. And that's the same year that Colorado also got hit by massive flooding from the same kind of weather system. And so what this allowed us to do is test 2 very long-held hypotheses, that these beaver ponds have limited flood attenuation capacity and that beaver ponds tend to fail during large floods and create worsen floods by creating outburst floods. Okay, so here's a map from the Alberta government showing the distribution of rain received during the June 2013 storm. That blue area is where there was somewhere between 150 and 280 millimeters of rain received in kind of a 48-hour period, which is a really intense rainstorm for this part of the world. Not quite a hurricane, but a sizable rainstorm. And the red areas, there was up to kind of 340, 350 millimeters of rain occurring. So this area in blue is the same area that is where we've been studying for quite some time. And so we were out there, me and a few other students, during the actual event. It started raining, we were digging soil pits, the soil pits were filling up, and so we kind of dropped what we were doing and put out any data loggers we happened to have in our packs into various beaver ponds and in the stream, just to see if we could collect any data and hopefully not lose our instruments. There was lots of hydrometric station damage during the event, and of course several people lost their lives in High River, which was the worst flooded area. We also were able to obtain imagery from the Alberta government relatively recently and do a post-storm analysis at some of the sites that we had previously done a census on of peatlands and beaver occupation of them. And so I thought I'd share a little bit on what we've done and what we've learned. We just published this research. So this is that Sibbald fen that I've mentioned a couple times, where we were out doing the work and instrumented. We managed to get loggers into ponds 52, 53, and 54. And they looked kind of like this in terms of fullness at the start of the storm event and grew to a much larger size during it. Our Met station was up and running, and we had a stream gauge that was up and running. And luckily, despite a small outburst flood happening, we were able to collect opportunistic data throughout the rain event. So at this site, our rain gauge recorded 195 millimeters of rain. The isopleth for the site, though, according to the more spatially interpreted data across the region, was closer to 220 to 230 millimeters. So, you know, a lot of rain in a fairly short period of time. And the rain kind of came in two bursts, as you can see in the hydrograph there on the top right-hand side. It's like we had an intense period of rain, and then a little lull in the storm, and then another intense period of rain. And so the middle graph there shows the beaver pond levels for those 3 beaver ponds where we had loggers put in. Ponds 52 and 54 remained, like the dams remained intact throughout the rainstorm, and they kind of degraded later on because the beaver were washed downstream in the flood. Pond 53 started to collect water and then failed. A 10-meter section of it completely failed, and we lost both of the beaver lodges that were in it. And it actually, the water was moving fast enough to shear peat that was dated to about 4,100 years old, and move it in blocks downstream in these large blocks of peat saltating down the stream channel, which is kind of neat. So we weren't able to get into the site during the actual event, except for at the very beginning. The roads were all washed out in this region, and you had to have a military escort to come in. But once it was safe again, my students and I were able to get in and take a look at what the data looked like. So initially during the storm event, the beaver ponds filled. So that overwinter period where the ponds were draining was really important in creating the capacity for the to have some water holding capacity at the beginning of this event. And then that water slowly started receding as we reached that lull in the storm. And then we saw an increase again in the pond storage in the second kind of phase of the rainstorm. And what's really interesting to me is that even though we had an outburst flood for pond 53, the pond, despite having a 10-meter hole in it, was able to actually transiently store water in that second phase of the event. And so this suggests that really pond dynamics are extremely dynamic. We haven't really described them very well in the literature yet. And even dams that are not structurally intact are able to hold back water even for just a bit. And that can matter. The short period that water can be held back can matter to whoever's living downstream, because really it's the synchronicity of flows meeting that creates the largest flows that you see in the massive flooding that's happening. So overall, kind of the 4 ponds that you see here stored about 1,900 meters cubed of water in them. Plus, on top of that, there was the groundwater storage in the elevated groundwater table in the 150 meters or so around each of those ponds. Okay, so how exactly can beaver ponds kind of slow the flow or release water more slowly? I think I want to go back to what a hydrograph looks like. And there's a hydrograph on here too. And I stole this image from EPA and I forgot to cite it, sorry. Okay, so here's just an example of what a stream hydrograph looks like, and it's separated into storm flow, so what happens during the rain event, and base flow, which is mostly the contribution from groundwater. And you can see when it starts raining, those blue bars, you see a rise in the stream level, and we call that the rising limb. And then it peaks, and then it slowly declines back. The stream level slowly declines back to where it was before the storm. And it's the slope of that falling limb of the hydrograph that's called the recession limb, and we can calculate the coefficient or the slope of it and compare it among different sites to see the impact of beaver dams. And so shown here on the right are a bunch of bars. So several of the different categories of dam flow types. We have gap flow, mixed, underflow, and overflow. And then also a stream in the middle there, where there are no beaver dams on it at all. And so there is a statistical difference between the stream, the recession coefficient for the stream section that has no dams on it compared to all of the other types of beaver dams considered collectively. So we see a faster recovery to pre-storm flows when there are no beaver dams on a stream channel as compared to when there are beaver dams on a stream channel. And there are some small statistical differences between different types of dam flow types, but really the point I wanted to make was that whether there's a beaver dam or not greatly affects the recession limb slope, and so how slowly water is released to downstream environments. Then we went and did kind of a regional analysis. We went back to 74 of the sites that we had previously done a census on of beaver habitation. It happened to be the year before the flood happened. And so we were able to look at structural integrity of beaver dam complexes owing to the flood. And so the kind of thought in the literature is that beaver dams are lost during large flood events, and they contribute to greater downstream flows and therefore present a great risk to downstream flooding. And that's one kind of argument that's used to keep the number of beaver low in an ecosystem. And their results do not support that hypothesis. So what we categorized our dam complexes into was 3 categories. The first one was persisted, where all of the beaver dams persisted and continued to hold water back. We have breached, where they all breached. And we have this persisted but affected. So that would mean there was a mix of some dams were structurally intact and others were not in that dam complex. And interestingly, it was usually the most upstream beaver dam that failed in the complex, and the rest of them tended to stay intact. So overall, we found that about 2/3 of the beaver dams across the Kananaskis region in an extreme flood remained intact and continued to hold water and serve a hydrological regulatory role during the flood, which was a bit surprising, but neat. Okay, just to make sure I wrap up so that there's time for questions. That was an extremely quick overview of the work that we're doing in the Rockies on peatlands and beaver ponds and ecohydrological impacts. But I thought that maybe to summarize a conceptualization of the beaver pond water balance would be useful to kind of summarize what we've learned and maybe where we should go next. Okay. So here we have the pond with our little beaver sitting in it, and the brown is supposed to be the peat, and the kind of whitish part of the peat is supposed to be the saturated zone with the water table, of course, in between. Okay, so what we've shown in the talk today is that beaver ponds mediate several key hydrological processes of peatlands. Things like groundwater recharge, water storage, and stream flow are all regulated by beaver ponds, even if those beaver ponds are not completely structurally intact. What we haven't done, though, is look at some of the other components of the water balance. For example, what we need to figure out is how evapotranspiration is affected by beaver living in peatlands. Just like water tables, we did see an effect on the water table height when we have beaver in the system, even though peatlands tend to be quite wet. So the question is if beaver are elevating the water table by about 13 centimeters, are they also enhancing evapotranspiration rates from mountain peatlands? And that's pretty important to getting the water balance of these sites right. The other thing we need to understand a lot better is this hydrological regulation of stream flow and storage of water in the system, both in open water ponds and in the groundwater system. Right now, beaver are not in hydrologic models. Hydrologic models are calibrated for how fast or slow water moves through a watershed. And most of these peatlands are sitting in these valley bottom positions, meaning they have a large regulating influence on water coming off of the peaks and moving into the lowlands. So I think it would be really great if we could start incorporating beaver impacts on hydrologic processes in hydrologic models. And I think some of the kind of algorithms and statistical relationships we've developed might be useful in doing that. And last, even though I didn't talk about it today, at the left-hand side of the diagram, we have a bunch of like interconnected circles, and that's supposed to represent the biogeochemical functioning of the system. Even though I didn't talk about it, we have a few people who are working on carbon fluxes in relation to beaver ponding and nutrient cycling. I think there's much more work to do in how that cycling works in relation to beaver occupation and abandonment cycles too. So I think I will leave it there and take any questions that are available.
Thank you, Cherie. Thank you so much. For our in-class students, please stick around if you're able. Of course, if you need to log on to a 1250 class, you don't have to walk across campus, but we of course understand you might need to grab a drink or something like that. So please stick around for the discussion. We've had discussion questions coming in from YouTube as viewers. So first of all, thank you for the talk, and you had a lot of nice comments from our YouTube audience over there. Our first question came from Dr. Peter Frederick. He's a wildlife ecologist, and he asked, do beavers get better at construction as they learn or age? And so thinking about, you have these beaver populations that are displaced or that are perhaps recolonizing, and of course they have to learn how to build. There's an innate sense, I suppose, but is there a learning process? And have you observed how that changes their hydrologic sort of role?
Well, I don't want to put my foot too far into that, as I'm not a wildlife biologist, but I spend a lot of time watching beaver, and I've watched beaver that have been reintroduced to areas, especially ones that hadn't lived in the wild previously, and that's really quite telling. So I have seen quite the range. Like little baby beaver, the kits actually learn really quickly, and the picture I showed of that adult and baby is a pair, is a little family in Saskatchewan, and it's kind of neat to go out and watch little kits learn from their parents how to build structures, how to cut material, how to move it, and they learn very quickly. There was a beaver reintroduction done at a site where we have been studying beaver dam analogs, so mock beaver dams, and those beaver did not survive. But part of the reason I think they didn't survive is they really didn't know what to do. They had lost their parents quite early, and they were in a rehabilitation center, and a good one, don't get me wrong, it's a good rehabilitation center, but they didn't have adult beavers to show them how to go about cutting trees, which trees to cut, and how to build structures. And what I noticed by watching them was that they kind of did a lot of swimming around, but they didn't actually do as much tree cutting as they would have needed to survive. Yeah.
It may need to be like a beaver training program or some sort in the reintroduction.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And then if I can just add to that for a sec. So I guess the other part of what they do is these complexes, especially in peatlands, are something that are built up over time. It's not one family at one given point of time that will develop all of these beaver ponds. Many of the beaver ponds that I showed in a couple of those little maps were actually there like decades ago. So it's an intergenerational process to build up a site, and beaver will come and reoccupy sites that they had been at in the past. So they're not always going and building new sites. They will move from site to site to site, but they tend to reoccupy sites that they've been at.
Thank you. Thomas, I see, I'm going to ask you to unmute. You got your hand up, so. there you go.
Hi, sorry about that. For some reason, I can't enter anything into the chat, but I wanted to ask why we've excluded beaver dams from our hydrological models for so long.
The short answer is that they're a pain. I mean, they mess up hydrographs, right? You get an artificially high water level as compared to the flow. And so you'll get these very strange numbers when you go to create your rating curve. And so the practice at, I know at USGS stations and certainly Water Survey of Canada stations is to rip them out. And so the other thing I think is not so many there are not so many eco-hydrologists around. There are a lot of hydrologists and trained through engineering, and consideration of biotic processes is a much newer idea than hydrologic model development. So I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet.
Good to hear. All right, thank you.
Thanks. Here's a question from Dr. Elliott White at University of Virginia. He asks, is carbon sequestration ability of peatlands limited by beaver dams? It would seem the creation of deep water habitats will limit primary production. And of course, it's a balance of production and respiration. So have you found anything about that in your work?
Yeah, so I had a postdoc who I showed earlier, Colin, who did some work. He's now a faculty member, and I have another postdoc, I think, who's on the call actually. I saw his question pop up, but yeah, so those places where I was showing that beaver ponds have higher hydraulic conductivity underneath them compared to the intact peat. What I didn't show is we're also finding quite a bit of carbon depletion under the beaver ponds, like 40–50% carbon depletion, which is substantial. So as soon as you flood a peatland, you're going to change the carbon dynamics and the carbon fluxes. And so we have some guesses at it from Colin's work that we've published a few years ago in Ambio on a kind of a global scale, showing that carbon flux from peatlands from beaver ponds is important, even on a global scale. And then Tariq, who's on the call, is doing some more detailed work on carbon and nutrient fluxes.
Yeah, it seems like a perfect sort of setting. You've got all this hydrologic infrastructure, and adding, some eddy flux towers and carbon net ecosystem exchange would be really cool.
It is. We just got one. So.
Oh, good. Awesome. Yeah.
Colleague of mine did.
So you had a question on there as well? Mark?
Yeah, just a quick question with regards to the bathymetry. First off, excellent talk. I really enjoyed it. Really interesting work, and fascinating to see the application of the hydrology and the linkage to humans, and kind of dispelling a historic unknown, but the value of the beaver dams for hydrologic control. But my question relates to more of a methodology one. Some of your graphics were some pretty, what looks to be a high resolution bathymetry of these beaver ponds. I'm just curious how you collected that information.
Oh yes, they are high resolution imagery. So it's really handy when you have beaver ponds that burst to get LiDAR imaging. So that's actually a courtesy of the Alberta government, because the flood was so severe and cost them billions of dollars of damage. They flew LiDAR over a certain area and finally have allowed us access to that great information. And so we're able to deliver, create those bathymetric maps. Previously, we had our TK GPS out and doing lots of points.
Yeah, I was wondering how you could do that subsurface, but now I know the truth. It's basically drained and you got it exposed. Okay, very good. Thank you.
gotta wait.
Yep.
Thanks. Well, I'll let's see. We got one more here coming in from Danielle Pintone. Do beavers reconstruct dams of the same shape and position after they're breached, or do they vary very much? It's like the same shape, same place, or is it just new beavers, new design?
It can be either. And so what it really depends on is whether there's any forage material left in that site, or whether they're going to abandon it for some time until new material is generated. So the great thing about beaver is they kind of shape the plant community to their liking by chewing part of it down, right? It promotes regrowth of species they particularly like. So if there is a breach in an area, but there's still plenty of food resources, they will actually usually go plug those holes up and continue living at the site. And if not, then they'll abandon the site until there is adequate forage available.
And we have one more, but I think it's from the inside job, because it's Tariq, but so he's throwing you some softballs maybe, but I think it's an interesting question anyway. But just generally thinking about these ponds and hydrologic processes with climate change, and perhaps more extreme events, do you think that their mitigation capacity is greater in the future, is more important, is sort of just staying the same, or how is climate going to affect this interaction?
Well, that's definitely something we're studying, because there is a lot of thought out there right now that we can really use beaver and beaver ponds to help mitigate both floods and droughts. And there's evidence certainly that can happen. And so they are being reintroduced by the thousands in the Western US, for example, Pacific Northwest. And they're also what's happening by stream restoration folks, practitioners, is creation of mock beaver dams to try to mimic some of the effects of beaver in places that are too far degraded for beaver to come into, so that they kind of have a kickstart so that beaver could maybe come into later. The other thing that is less talked about, that we have a paper hopefully coming out in the next couple of weeks in scientific reports about, is that beavers dams and beaver themselves are impacted by climate change. And what we are showing in that work is that the predicted increases in stream flow will make it less able for beaver to build dams on some of those stream networks. So declines in the number of beaver dams. So kind of a complex set of reactions that beaver have an ability to certainly mitigate some of the effects of changing climate, but they themselves will be impacted, and their ability to mitigate will be impacted.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we're a bit over time, so I just want to thank you again, Dr. Westbrook. You're welcome, of course, online to unmute yourself and clap for real, or you can give the little clap hands. And I'll announce that next week our speaker is Dr. John Kamenowski, Associate Professor at Florida International University. He'll be talking about interactions among discrete and continuous disturbances in coastal ecosystems. So we'll stay in wetlands likely, but we'll be going to the coast. Thank you so much, Dr. Westbrook, for your kicking us off this semester and for this great talk about ecohydrology. Very much appreciated.
Thanks for having me, and nice to see you all.
Hey, there you go. There's some real humans on. Giving you a shout out. Thank you very much, everyone. Anyone in class, if you have any questions, please feel free to stay on or to send an email after. All right.